Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Andrew McLaren, President of the Board of Fellowship Place. I'm delighted to welcome such a large audience to our event this evening. I'm deeply grateful to our sponsors for this evening. Anthem is our platinum sponsor. Gold sponsors are the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven and Yale New Haven Hospital. Our silver sponsor is the Yale Office of New Haven Affairs. And we also have as donor sponsors, Southern Connecticut State University and two law firms, which is very much in the spirit of the evening, Knight and Serratelli and Lynch, Traub, Keefe and Aranti. So enormous thanks to all of them. So many people attending this event know, and many more know about Emily Bazelon. Included, of course, in that are her colleagues and students at the Yale Law School. Readers of the New York Times enjoy her extremely interesting writing, as do readers of her books. And the most recent of those is Charged, the new movement to transform American prosecution and end mass incarceration, which is both enlightening and very tied in to this evening's conversation. And many, myself included, feel we know Emily really well, although in fact we don't at all, because we hear her voice weekly on the political gabfest, where she combines insight and humor and compassion and intense listening and lightning fast thinking on her feet, all of which makes listening to her a huge pleasure. And finally, she's a local force for good, as witness her generosity in contributing her time this evening, which allows us to offer this event free of charge to a large audience as part of Mental Health Awareness Month. So Emily, thank you so much for giving all of us such a wonderful gift this evening. And before you begin, I'd like to ask our Executive Director, Mary Guerrera, under whose guidance Fellowship PACE has done so well in this past very difficult year, to explain how our evening together will go. Again, welcome to our audience and our panelists, and to you, our speaker. Now, over to Mary.
Thanks, Andrew, and welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. Before I tell you about how the evening is going to flow tonight, I do want to just tell you a little bit about Fellowship Place, because we do have some people registered for the event tonight that are new to the agency. So Fellowship Place is located on a beautiful campus in the Dwight neighborhood of New Haven, about 1 block down from the big Stop and Shop on Whaley Avenue. And we are like a one-stop shop for people who are struggling with mental illness or substance abuse. We don't provide any clinical services, but we provide everything else that people need to get their life on track. Everything from permanent supported housing to job training, job placement, counseling, case management, and most importantly, day programming that gives people positive things to do with their day, opportunities to socialize with each other and develop a peer support network, and also to get involved in a number of different programs that really enhance the quality of their life and how they cope with their illnesses and the many challenges that they face. Really important to that programming is the expressive arts. We do art, drama, writing, and also a lot of programming that helps people with their overall health, exercise, sports, things like that. So we are really, really fortunate tonight to have 3 panelists with us who will enhance and support everything that Emily is going to talk about. These are people that we work with in various programs in the agency, and they have a history of incarceration. And after Emily's presentation, they will share some of their experiences with you before they went to jail, while they were in jail, and what it was like when they got out of jail. Criminal justice reform is a really important issue for us here at Fellowship Place because we work with so many people that are transitioning out of jail. And once they get out, finding a place to live, finding a job, getting their life back on track is not easy when they have that criminal conviction on their records. So let me just tell you how the evening is going to flow tonight. The whole program is being recorded so that we can post it hopefully on our website and share it with others who could not make it tonight. The audience, those of you that are participating, you'll notice that your mics are turned off and your cameras are turned off. That's so that we can have everybody's full attention on Emily and on our panelists when it's their time to talk. And lastly, we do want to have a real conversation with all of you tonight. So I encourage you to use the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen to type in any questions that you have for Emily or for any of our panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our main event, our guest presenter, Emily Bazelon.
Thank you so much for that great introduction. I am so glad that we have these excellent panelists here tonight to speak from experience and help think through your questions. And I am all for lots of lively discussion. I always feel like I learn from events like this from the questions people ask and the answers I hear. So I look forward to that. Before that happens, I am hopefully about to talk for about half an hour with you as soon as I figure out how to share my screen. Yeah, let's see. Oops, now I have to get this onto the right presentation. Hang on a second, sorry everybody. Okay, let me just go back to the beginning of my slideshow. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. So I wrote a book that was published in 2019, and it's about mass incarceration, and in particular, it's about the role that prosecutors have played in driving mass incarceration in the United States. I want to frame this talk a little bit differently because I know that the concern of the Fellowship Place is about the effect of the criminal justice system, particularly on people with mental illness. And so I want to kind of highlight that issue as I go. So I'm going to kind of start by setting a sort of general context about mass incarceration, then talk about the way that people with mental illness are particularly burdened by the American system. And then I'll kind of explain to you some dynamics I think that are at play with the police and prosecutors and the way the whole system functions. So just to give you a kind of overall sense of context and numbers, in the 1970s, and really for the 20th century up until the 1970s, the United States had the same kind of rate of incarceration as countries in Europe that we commonly compare ourselves to. And it was a relatively low rate of incarceration. What has happened since the 1970s is that our rate has quintupled, and it has far, far outpaced any increases in our peer countries. So we've just had this enormous rise in the number of people we lock up. And there are lots of kind of multifactorial explanations for this. One of them has to do with the rise in crime that started in the late 70s and fears that unless we locked people up, we were inviting yet more crime. So there was, at the beginning, this real rise in crime that people were responding to. But as you can see from this next slide, that's not a complete explanation because the rise in incarceration continues in the United States far longer than the rise in crime. So what you see here in this slide is that crime drops steeply beginning in the late 80s and continuing through the 90s and really continuing through at least about 2018. But you still have this enormous continuing rise in jail and prison. So what's going on here? I think there are a few really important factors. One of them is that the laws we put in place beginning in the 70s, and really they took off in the 80s and 90s, kind of locked us into this system where we have lots and lots of punishment. That's what we're offering as our response to crime. And I'm talking specifically about mandatory minimum prison sentences, which don't give judges a choice about the kind of punishment to impose based upon the individual circumstances or characteristics of a case or of a defendant. And I'm also talking about the expansion of the criminal code, which has allowed for stacking of charges. So somebody does one thing, but they may face multiple charges for that, and that really exacerbates and amplifies the kind of punishment they could receive if they're actually convicted of it. And I also think it's really important to highlight the role that race plays in over incarceration in the United States. And here I'm going to rely on the work of Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow, which is a book that some of you may be familiar with. What Michelle really succeeded, I think, at getting more at the forefront of people's consciousness was that there was a way in which locking up a hugely disproportionate share of Black people, and in particularly Black men, was a kind of furtherance of the laws of slavery and the laws of Jim Crow that really disadvantaged Black people and treated them differently for the purposes of punishment. So you have all of this kind of going on and feeding this American punishment machine, really, that just continues to operate at a very high volume long after the actual crime rise has ended. I think one really important factor, a kind of conceptual question in all of this, is who gets treated as a criminal. And I really like this slide, which I didn't put together myself, because I think it shows the way in which we think about a bad act differently depending on the group that is most likely to commit it. So if you blow through the easy pass toll on the highway, you're not going to get in trouble the first time. Then you might face some threat to your car registration. If you don't pay your parking ticket, you could pay a fine the first time, and then there might be an effect on your car. If you jump the subway fare in New York or another city, you're going to pay a high fine, and you're also going to face criminal sanction. You're going to get arrested. Even though this is the smallest cost to society, this is the one that we treat effectively like stealing. And people who, jump the subway and don't pay their fare tend to be poor people in the United States as compared to people who get parking tickets or who don't pay for their easy pass toll because they're driving. And so this way of thinking for me is really helps show that there are there's lots of kinds of misconduct, and we have made these decisions about what we treat as criminally sanctioned in our society, and there's nothing like objectively true or necessary about the categories that we've created. This is also true in a way that really creates racial disparity. So up here on the slide, in front of you, you can see the numbers for people who get arrested for carrying a gun illegally in this country. And it is far disproportionately Black people who face this penalty. It is not Black people who disproportionately own guns. So what you're seeing here is some combination of who doesn't have a permit for their gun for whatever reason, and who is getting policed for having a gun that they don't get permission to have. I could also show you a kind of similar set of numbers about drugs. White people are just as likely as Black people in the United States to use drugs, but they are far less likely to get arrested or charged or to go to prison for using drugs. And so again, we're making these, relatively arbitrary decisions about who gets in trouble for similar conduct that has a lot to say about our values as a society and who we police, but again, does not necessarily go to some objective truth about greater wrongdoing. So I think this directly relates to the problem of the kind of overlap between mental illness and incarceration. We have a very high proportion of people in state and federal prison who've been diagnosed with a mental illness. It is true, as you can see, both at the prison and at the level of local jails. We also have this huge problem of people with mental illness being incarcerated, being locked up, and then not getting the kind of mental health care and treatment that they need to get better, to be able to take their medication, to be in a more stable situation. And again, you see these very high percentages in these numbers. And as a result of all these people getting locked up with mental illness and the lack of treatment, you see people having serious psychological distress in jail. And in Connecticut, we also have these high numbers of people. We are not at all exempt from this kind of national pattern about how we treat mentally ill people in the carceral system. And I think what we're really seeing here, and I'm sure this is familiar to a lot of you, is this problem of having no real safety net to catch people in when they have mental illness and there's any kind of wrongdoing. And so what we do is we scoop them up and we put them into jail and prison because that is the kind of only place that's really available when we have people with mental illness who are not following all the rules. Other people might not get punished in this way, people without mental illness. And people with mental illness, when they're in these carceral settings, tend to have a real struggle because they're not getting the services and treatment that they need. So an alternative way of thinking about how we could deal with this problem is prevention. And I don't simply mean mental health treatment and psychiatric care, although I think that's a really important answer to this question, would be to simply bolster our mental health treatment and care options. That is absolutely an important part of the picture. But we also have findings that show that if you add a community nonprofit to a neighborhood, you can actually see a drop in the murder rate. This is research by Patrick Sharkey, who's a sociologist at NYU, and it's the kind of rare cause and effect finding that, at least for me, really jumped out when I learned about it, because it shows that if you have more services in a neighborhood, you can really affect violent crime. So how can you really understand what's going on here when you see a finding like this? For me, it's a good illustration is a playground. So if you have a neighborhood and there's a vacant lot, nothing going on there, it turns into a magnet for crime often. People aren't really around it. It's not a safe place to hang out. It's kind of available for a small number of people to cause trouble. And it's not going to be a place where they're necessarily going to be seen doing that or feel concerned that they're breaking some kind of social compact or disrupting the fabric of the neighborhood, because it's kind of out there for them to access. If people who live in that neighborhood, or if the city that it's part of, provide resources to turn that vacant lot into a playground, well, then you have a whole different dynamic. You have kids, you have grown-ups looking out for those kids, you have more foot traffic. You have people in the neighborhood who can really serve as a kind of eyes and ears, what are called informal guardians, for preventing crime. I mean, I think we all know that if you're in a busy space in a city, you're just much less likely to have people dealing drugs or committing other kinds of crimes, because that's not a comfortable space for them to be doing that kind of thing in anymore. And so that's how I understand this call for more community nonprofits. It's about really making the community more connected, giving people more entry points, more opportunities for services, for getting to know each other, for really drawing a neighborhood together. And, I think that a lot of affluent and middle class people kind of know this intuitively, that the reason they like their neighborhoods are not that the police are standing on every corner, but that they just feel like they are safe and functional places where there are public parks that people want to hang out in, where schools are inviting, where there are stores. And what you often see is in poor neighborhoods is a willingness to kind of let them slide into a more derelict and vulnerable kind of spaces. I also want to talk about policing directly. We have this problem in this country that's gotten a lot of attention with the Black Lives Matter movement since 2014, and in particular since the murder of George Floyd last year. And often people with mental health crises are the victims of these police shootings. And we also have, I think, if we're thinking about this particular population, a real incentive to change how policing works. So one of the big questions in how to prevent police shootings and other kinds of violence by the police towards people is like, do we actually really need the police to show up every time 911, someone calls 911? Are there other kinds of responses in that situation that could be more effective? And we've had the beginnings of alternatives show up around the country. So one example is a program called Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, which for the last several years has been sending out what are called crisis responders to certain 911 calls. So you might get someone who's trained in social work or conflict resolution rather than an officer with a gun. And the estimates that have started to come in from different cities range from about 20% to 38% in terms of how many 911 calls could really be handled by people who are not armed officers. And I sort of feel like this is one of the most exciting set of alternatives and opportunities and possibilities for alternatives on the ground and also for research that we've gotten in the last year in thinking about reimagining the work of the police. And there's a lot of evidence that the police get called for all kinds of situations where their particular training and being armed is not necessary, and it's probably not even like the best idea. And I'm not just talking about, the cat up in the tree or someone with mental illness who would be much better in the hands of someone who had training. I'm also talking about things like an accident, a car accident on the highway. If there's no evidence of any, drunk driving or other kinds of wrongdoing in that situation, you might want someone who is trained in how to write up an accident report, as opposed to a police officer answering that call. And so there is this really good article by a law professor also actually at NYU named Barry Friedman, which is all about the police and how they actually spend their time and the kinds of alternatives that we might be interested in trying, which I really recommend people who are interested in this question, and I'm happy to talk more about it. One of the exciting ideas for changing the way the police do their jobs is the hope that we could increase the number of crimes they solve, in particular violent crimes. So one of the surprising things that Professor Friedman found in his work is that the police actually spend a real minority of their time on investigating and solving crimes. And I think that is a partial explanation for why a lot of cities have really faced this problem of declining solve rates for murders and for shootings. You can see that in Chicago, this has been a particular problem, but in a lot of American cities, even if the decline is not this dramatic, you would see a similarly kind of depressing decline happening in terms of the violent crimes that police actually solve. And, part of what's going on here has to do with trust. If you have a community that's really at odds with its police force, perhaps because of police shootings or other police violence, or because people feel like they've been mistreated at the hands of the police, sometimes people with mental illness, sometimes people without, then you really have an obstacle. People are not going to be willing to talk to the police, to serve as witnesses in court, to do all the things that we need them to do in order to solve homicides and shootings in particular. So that is part of this whole dynamic here in terms of improving the level of responsiveness and trust in the criminal justice system with people who live in cities. So now I want to talk a little bit about the focus of my book, which is really about the power of prosecutors and the way in which I argue that they're a kind of missing piece for explaining how we've had this quintupling of the incarceration numbers in the United States since the 80s to this huge total of almost 2.2 million people. one of the pieces of research that really informs my work in my book is this finding about charging. So the act of charging a crime, that is the part of the criminal justice process that prosecutors solely control. And what John Pfaff, who's a professor at Fordham Law School, found in some quantitative work several years ago was that prosecutors really changed the way they use their charging power between about 1990 and the 2010s. And what you see is that district attorneys who are elected, who are responding to some of the same concerns about rising crime that fuel the rise of mandatory minimum sentences and the expansion of the criminal code, these district attorneys start bringing felony charges, the more serious kinds of criminal charges, at a much higher rate. They effectively double the bringing of felony charges from 1 out of 3 people who get arrested to 2 out of 3 people who get arrested. And that shift is the way in which prosecutors themselves, a kind of chief way, are contributing to this rise in mass incarceration, because people who are facing felony charges are going to be much more likely to go to jail or prison. And this is, again, as I was saying, kind of part and parcel with this shift that's happening on the part of state legislators. So state legislators are, this is their kind of share of the over-incarceration picture by creating these laws that allow for the ratcheting up of punishment. And what you also see here is you see jail playing, at least for me, a kind of unexpected role. So before I started working on my book, I thought that the reason people had to pay bail so that they could go home as opposed to going to jail before trial was that you had to set bail and make people pay bail in order to get them to come back to court and to make sure that they wouldn't commit more crimes. And it turns out that that is not the function that bail is playing in American law at all. And we know this because we have a few places in the country, Washington, D.C. and Kentucky among them, that have not had cash bail since the 1970s. And they have not had a higher rate of people failing to appear in court or people committing crimes between the time that they're charged initially and the time that they're sentenced for that crime. Instead, what you see is that jail, because people can't pay bail, turns into a mill for plea bargains. It's really a tool that prosecutors are using to get people to plead guilty, and that the whole system is relying on to deal with this hugely increasing volume of criminal charges that we're facing in the United States since the 1980s. And the reasons for this are kind of obvious. If you are being locked up, maybe you can't pay your rent, maybe you're about to lose your job, maybe you're worried about your kids and your family, you are going to be much more likely to just agree to sign that you are pleading guilty to this crime because you have this huge incentive to just get out of jail. The notion that you're supposed to wait around for months, for over several court appearances while you fight for your innocence or you fight to convince the prosecutor to drop the charges, that just becomes out of reach and unrealistic for a lot of people. And that includes people who are actually innocent of the crime for which they're charged or who've been arrested illegally. It is just a really big burden to impose that people are supposed to fight for their rights when they're actually in jail and in custody. And this has become a kind of fundamental building block of our carceral system, that we lock people up before they've been proved guilty of anything, as a way to make the system's wheels continue to turn by producing guilty pleas, which spare prosecutors and judges and courts in general a huge amount of work. So there's also this problem with jail, which is the opposite of what I said before about jail before trial preventing crime. It turns out that a year and a half or more out from a decision to hold someone in detention pre-trial, you actually statistically see them commit more crimes. And that seems like a kind of counterintuitive finding, because while people are locked up, they're being deterred from at least committing crimes on the street. But what you see if you increase the time horizon here and you look out a year and a half or more, is that people who are in jail, you know, for a variety of reasons, tend to be more prone to commit future crimes than people who got to go home. And again, I think the explanation here, it actually turns out to be kind of easy to see, that you're around a lot of other people who may be more prone to committing crimes, and you're also more desperate. you're in a circumstance in which you have fewer options, fewer ways to earn money, even once you get out, and more of a sense of urgency often about supporting the people you care about who are around you or supporting yourself. And so there is this way in which jail, especially before trial, turns out to be enormously counterproductive for American society. And again, we see mentally ill people often especially affected by this, given the higher rates at which they get locked up. The kind of final element of the system I wanted to talk about here is this phenomenon of the vanishing trial. So, you know, if you watch crime shows, if you follow criminal law when it's in the news, we tend to be very focused on trials, right? I mean, we had just had this trial of Derek Chauvin, the police officer who killed George Floyd in Minneapolis, that was on television every day. And I think a lot of people were following it avidly. And that was a really important trial. But it also produced in some ways the wrong lesson, because trials are actually incredibly rare in American law because of all of these dynamics of increasing plea bargaining and making it much more conducive for defendants to plead guilty. About 98% of convictions in most states are obtained through plea bargains, not through trials. And you see that here in these statistics about how rare trials have become. One of the real problems with the vanishing trial in American law is that it removes this incredibly important check on state power. If you go to trial, you force the government to prove its case against you. And you force it to prove that it arrested you legally, that it had a right to search whatever evidence that the police may have come up with against you. If you plead guilty, all of those rights are you're basically waiving them. And so when we worry about things like illegal search and seizures and the police overusing their power, especially in making street arrests, this phenomenon of the vanishing trial is really important for understanding part of what's happening in those situations. So in most states, people get to select the district attorneys and the state's attorneys who prosecute the cases in their cities and counties. This is a bit of a funny part of my talk to give in Connecticut, because in Connecticut, we are a big exception. We do not actually elect prosecutors. Prosecutors in Connecticut are chosen by a committee of people who are selected by the governor. And so we have a different mechanism that is separate from the electoral system. But if you're interested in national criminal justice reform, then this whole question of what kinds of prosecutors voters choose has become enormously consequential in the last few years, when we've had a movement to elect different kinds of prosecutors in this country who are promising to take progressive steps to decarcerate and shrink the footprint of the criminal justice system. And if you've been following this conversation, what's been happening really since 2015 and mostly 2016 is that civil rights groups, and sometimes inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement or by activists who came up doing that kind of work, have really worked to choose different kinds of candidates to either run for a vacant district attorney seat or to challenge a very old school prosecutor who's an incumbent. And in 2016, people running on progressive platforms got elected in like a dozen cities around the country, including Chicago that year and Denver, and several other kind of mid-sized or large cities. And that phenomenon of progressive candidates running for DA and winning has really continued to grow since 2016. So you see someone like Larry Krasner get elected in Philadelphia. You see that was in 2017. He's actually running for re-election with a big primary next week that I'm watching with a lot of interest. And more recently, you see people on the same kinds of platforms get elected to the DA's office in cities like Boston and San Francisco and Los Angeles, Austin, Texas, even other parts of Texas, other big counties, states like Michigan. So this is really a phenomenon that's moving across the country. And what the statistic in this slide is trying to show is that because cities are such big places and the elections for DA take place in cities or at the county level, if you have 125 of the biggest cities or counties in the country elect progressive candidates at district attorney, you can have an effect on up to half of the population in terms of how criminal justice actually functions. So sometimes people ask me like, well, is this really the ideal way to make change for criminal justice? Because if you elect a new DA, they may make a lot of changes, but they're only a part of the system. Even if they have a lot of power, they don't control everything. And also they could lose the next time around. So is this really a kind of permanent source of change? And I think that it's not. It's not the ideal way to change things. Ideally, you change things through the legislature, statewide. You revoke mandatory minimum sentences. You dial back heavy punishments. You create alternatives to incarceration. You increase mental health services at the state level. And Congress too can play some kind of role here. The problem is that it can be much harder to get the whole state to move on these issues, given how state legislative power is distributed between urban and rural parts of the state. And so my sort of hope is that these district attorneys are a kind of leading force for change, a different kind of law enforcement lobby, and then you'll have state reforms kind of follow because they're sort of showing the way. So one of the important things about some of the new DAs who are getting elected is the kind of diversity they represent. Traditionally, prosecutors have been heavily white and heavily male. You can see from this slide that that is not necessarily true of the people who are getting elected on progressive prosecutors. They represent lots of different demographics in the United States, and they also represent both parties. There are people who are elected as Republicans as well as Democrats who are interested in pursuing a different kind of commitment to fairness and justice than the old school prosecutors who promised to lock people up for really long periods of time, who often ran on their high conviction rates and on heavy sentences, including the death penalty. This is a kind of recent finding that shows a really interesting effect, I think, of electing different kind of DAs. So despite what I just said about the bipartisan nature of progressive, the movement to elect progressive prosecutors, it is still true that Republicans running for DA tend to be more conservative and more bent on incarceration. And so what you see here is that a county that elects a Republican district attorney can expect to see prison admissions rise by about 20% over the following 2 years. On the other hand, if you elect a person of color as district attorney, who often might be a Democrat, you can expect prison admissions to fall by 10% over the same period. And what's important here is this is a finding that's independent of any rise or decline in the crime rate or in the arrest rate. So again, we're sort of isolating here the role that prosecutors play in the system and showing that their decisions, independent of what's happening with crime in their cities and counties and independent of the work of the police, is really having this effect on how many people go to prison in the place where they are in office. And I want to close by returning to my slide about crime and incarceration rates to make this final point that, you know, we really continue to be out of sync here in terms of the amount of punishment that our carceral bureaucracy continues to produce versus the amount of crime. At the same time, if this slide was completely up to date through 2020, you would see a less comforting end to the graph, the line on the graph about crime, because in the last year and a half or so, we have seen crime begin to rise again. And that is both, I would say, really important, but is yet difficult phenomenon to fully understand, and is also the biggest threat to criminal justice reform. We have never had a period in American society before where crime rose and our commitment to decarceration held. We have always seen people in previous eras react to rising crime by going back to this notion that we just have to lock people up in order to keep ourselves more safe. And so I think there is this big looming question about whether efforts to decarcerate, to make sure that the police are obeying the law, are using force only when necessary, all these efforts at reform could really be threatened by the rising crime rate. In terms of why the crime rate is rising, I would say that it is too early for us to know. It's possible that the pandemic is playing a big role here, and that when it ends, a lot of the ways in which it's been destabilizing, with so many young people out of school, for example, and people in more desperate straits in some places, and a kind of general sense of dislocation, it's possible that that will help the crime rate fall. It's also possible that the police have been kind of pulling back in some cities in response to protest. And it's also, possible there are other dynamics at work here that we don't fully understand. But whatever is actually going on, this is a real challenge for people who are committed to decarceration. And I think if your concern in particular is people with mental illness, given how much they can be swept up unfairly into the criminal justice system, this increase in crime is something to watch. And also, I think one way we can all contribute to trying to make sure that it doesn't just kind of take over the political dynamic is to be really careful about the kinds of information we pay attention to in terms of crime and the kinds of information we spread. So, sometimes on neighborhood listservs, you'll see people post things that unintentionally can be quite fear-mongering because they focus us on the scary things happening around us, as opposed to all the times when everything is calm and stable and functional. So that's something I'm happy to talk more about too, but it's a kind of good note to end on in terms of one thing that we can all do to try to be helpful to this political dynamic that drives so much of our response in this area. So thanks so much for listening. I am going to stop the screen share and I will look forward to our question and answer period.
Emily, thanks so much for that very informative and insightful talk. I think that when we begin to hear from our panelists, they are going to be able to put a very personal spin on all of the major points that you just made. I'd like to begin by just giving each of our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves and tell us very briefly why they wanted to be a part of this panel. Wes, at the very end of the table, can we begin with you?
Good evening, my name is Wes, 56-year-old Black male, product of incest. I believe my mental health begun at a very young age. It was not addressed, and so I resorted to my own survival skills and antisocial behavior, and that's another reason why it wasn't addressed, because I was never in a place long enough to receive mental health treatment. So that's why I'm here. I'm here because I would like to be a mouthpiece for those that are suffering and going through mental health situations that do not get the attention, and they get robbed for a lot of good things in life. Thank you.
Thanks, Wes. How about you, Jordan?
Hi, my name is Jordan Smith. I'm 33 years old. I'm here because I've been in and out of incarceration since the age of 16, and I experienced a lot of injustices within the Department of Corrections, the judicial system, and also experienced a lot of mental health issues that I feel so hasn't been addressed. I'm a big advocate of criminal justice reform, and I'm just here to be a part of the change and be a part of the solution.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Betty.
Hi, Emily. This is Betty. I've been a member here at Fellowship approximately since 2007. Fellowship Place had became my family. They had helped me out so much, words can't explain. Well, I am a victim. That's why I'm here on this panel. I was a victim controlled by the system and was a victim in the system. So that was, it wasn't confused as it is now to understand that it was wrong. So I'm here And I was incarcerated in 1996 because I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I'd like to continue on the conversation when we get back to that.
All right, so I just want to remind the audience that we really would like this to be a dialogue. So if you have questions for Emily or anyone on the panel, please just type them into the question and answer box on your screen. But to get the conversation started, I'm going to start off with a couple of questions. And the first thing that I think everyone would be very interested in hearing about from each of you is what your experience was like from the time that you were arrested and then charged, going through the court system, and then making it and then jail. Who would like to start?
I'll start first. No, I did not understand. I didn't understand what they were saying. They didn't have the time to make clear to me, as I understand today, as I reiterate that, no, I lost my right by not understanding. And I couldn't take it to trial because I didn't even know what I was going through. Because I know I was innocent, but I went to trial and still lost. I still got 49 years. So, you know something, when I think back at it and what I experienced, you know, that the proceeding in the courts, when you got a public defendant, he's riding with the DA. So all that is controlled by the minority. You know, the minority is poor. They know that they're going to be a member. They know they're going to get $40,000 off an individual. And as I know that today, it makes me sick. I'll stop there.
Jordan, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I could kind of add on to what she's saying as well. When I was first incarcerated at the age of 16, I had no knowledge of how the criminal justice system worked, how the courts work. I was basically considered incompetent. So therefore, I really didn't have an understanding of my rights and even what I was charged with. So how the court system works, especially here in Connecticut, is you have a chance to go to trial for your voice to get heard and for you to, you know, explain yourself. However, if you lose trial, you're threatened with the maximum penalty, which is a tactic that the prosecutors, the judge, the lawyers use to, you know, get you to take a plea bargain. And even like there's a lot of innocent people that just was afraid, me as well, to face a trial in a jury with the you know, the threat of getting a maximum penalty. So that's one thing with going in. Now, my experiences while in prison was pretty rough too. Well, when I first began going to prison, I was labeled as a gang member based off the geographics of where I'm from and where I live. In DOC, they have like a list that's considered like security risk groups or safety threat groups that's based off certain neighborhoods and certain communities. So if you know, my address or another person's address is on a specific street in a rough neighborhood, which is a predominantly Black or Hispanic neighborhood, we have a chance of getting labeled as a gang member just from being from that community. Now, when you're labeled that inside the prison system, you're now housed in the most restrictive housing. So most of my experiences in prison, I was forced to be housed in what is considered solitary confinement, which therefore, I developed more mental health issues just from that environment. And seeking, help for developed mental health issues that were developed because of the circumstances and your situation, it's hard to get treatment because I didn't come in with a record of extreme mental health issues. So, I'm still here now, fighting to, now that I'm out, to get certain things addressed, which I am. Being in the community with, programs such as fellowship and other programs that's in the community have been very helpful with that.
So Jordan, why don't you hold that thought, because I want to give Wes a chance to talk a little bit about his experience from getting arrested up to jail. And then we're going to get back to that point about getting mental health care while you were incarcerated. So Wes, why don't you take over?
Yeah, so my experience, I was a ward of the state since I was 6 months of age, which means that the Department of Children and Family Services was my legal guardian. With that said, I was in a lot of institutions, hospitals, foster homes, at a very young age. So I didn't have, the ability to be able to survive like a regular child, because I didn't know that I was suffering from mental health situations. They just thought I was just an angry child. But my experiences as a child and going through institutions and hospitals, it was really tough. It was really tough. I didn't really know who I was as an individual because I wore all these masks to try to survive in these situations. Talking about receiving love, that was something that I didn't receive, because how do you get love if you're being bounced around, every couple months to a different placement? So it was rough for me. So I didn't have any skills that I had was basically the survival skills that I acquired in order to survive, coming up as a young man. Although I will say this, in the judicial system, I've done a lot of time. I have met some people that are employed by the DOC that have taken the time out to tell me, hey, listen, Wes, you're a real intelligent individual, have taken the time to show me things and to, just be there for me, because, hearing of my past experiences that I've been through. So I'm not going to say that, everyone, in the DOC, or, they don't care, because a lot of my problems came from what I did, my behavior, because I definitely, had my share of being, disruptive, and so, with that said, I do believe that there are those in the DOC that, have a love for their job and have a love for people and have compassion, for people, in the human race. So, that's where I'm at, and like I said, I'm here because I just know that there's so many people suffering from this mental health, situation, and that don't have anyone, to be there for them, to do things for them, to guide them,
So Wes, I think that's a good segue, if I can interrupt. So all of you have shared that prior to going to jail for the first time or the second time or the third time, you all struggled with some mental health problems, maybe some drug abuse problems. Once you got in jail, did you get mental health care? And was the care provided routinely? Did you ask for help? Were you able to get help? Or did you not get any help at all because you were, as you were saying, Jordan, in solitary confinement most of the time? Betty, do you want to share?
Yes, I ain't gotten help. Well, while I was incarcerated, yeah, I was getting treated every month for mental health. The years I was there, even till I got home, they sent me to my daughter. They called my daughter, made sure I had a place to go when I was released. So I came straight to my daughter. And then I got into a program there a year, and then I got into mental health, which I was here 13 years ago till now, and so about 17 years of fellowship, and so I'm here.
So how about you, Jordan? Were you able to get mental health care when you were in jail?
No.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, everybody's experience is different in prison. So I'm not here to say that there is no help for people in prison with mental health. My experience was different. And a lot of it was due to the labels that they had me as a security threat member or being a part of some type of gang affiliation. So there's mental health staff available around the clock. However, from my experience, it's only for the most extreme and severe cases. I never been suicidal. So, it's like that's the main thing that's focused on in that environment. So I've asked to be like, diagnosed or just to see if I have any type of issues, because I couldn't really put the finger on it myself, but I just felt that something was wrong. Something wasn't right within my mental health. And I continually expressed that within the department. And every time I was told that I was okay, I was fine, because I wasn't doing the extreme to show it. And I was kind of probably more passive and kind of dealt with myself within myself, but I still wanted to seek that help. And while I was in prison, I was told I was fine. I didn't have any mental health conditions. Well, now, since being released, I have a therapist and I have a doctor, and I've been diagnosed with numerous mental health conditions. And I'm actually getting treated for numerous conditions that was overlooked while I was in prison. So that's why I would say that I didn't get any treatment within prison.
Thanks for that. Now, Wes, you mentioned that there were some people in your experience when you were in jail who were, very supportive of you. But were you able to get any mental health care? Did you see a clinician or a psychiatrist while you were in prison?
So
did you feel a need for it?
So because of the road that I traveled in my behavior, like Jordan said, being labeled as a gang member, the only time that I received mental health counseling to talk to me was when they're about to put me in seg, because they wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to cut myself up or hang up. That was the extent of the mental health that I received while I was incarcerated. The other time, the only other help that I would receive if I spoke to somebody like, you know, that I knew in there, whether it was a captain, whether it was a lieutenant or an officer, that can you get in touch with mental health? I need to speak to them. You know, other than that, I didn't see mental health. And, you know, I think that, like Jordan said, it's more so for the people that are cutting up or hanging up or telling staff that they're going to hang up. Other than that, I did not get any mental health treatment while I was incarcerated.
And can you share, whoever feels comfortable sharing a little bit about what your treatment was like in jail? Do you feel that you were treated the same as everyone else, or do you feel that you were treated differently at times because of the neighborhood that you came from, or because of your race, or other things that may have come into play in terms of how you were treated by the COs, the correctional officers?
Yes, that goes back to, I don't know, they was maybe looking at my pedigree or something, that I used to prosecute before I went in, but that was totally a different charge when I was in there. But I was sexual abuse my time I got into the jail, several times, over and over, repeatedly. But I didn't know who they talked to. I see captains, sergeants every day. I see the mental health, but I didn't know to tell them, because at that point, I was getting compensated, I was getting like a joint or some cigarettes or some cookies. I was just in my 20s, so, but I stayed to that city jail 2 years before I did the bid, the 49. Then I went, 3 months later, the same thing was going on there. I don't know, it was my pedigree they read or what, but just still that messed with my mental. And then when I tried to, like I was conspired, they worked against me. They gave me another charge in prison 3 months after I got there, because the same thing was happening to me from the city jail. Then I got to prison, they locked me up in jail and they put me in segregation. Then they put me in a hole. And then I didn't even know that a man didn't supposed to take my pictures, in the news. I didn't know that. Now I have a class 8 suit, but they found me here in New Haven that I can sue Albion Correctional, because all that got out, and a lot of inmates already got paid, but I haven't got to that point yet. But I didn't know, I knew that now this is it, that I know now that I don't know, my life is over or what. That moment, I didn't know what I was feeling or what I was carrying. But I know when they put me in the hole, and that happened, and it was weird. I've never seen a man take the picture, but women officers were there too. But a man didn't supposed to do. But that got out to argue me, so they came down on it. So everything is okay on that point, because now they're informed they don't have to do that anymore. They lost their jobs too.
So we have a question from our audience that I think some of you can answer it. And I think you've hit upon it, because you said you were put in the hole and how you were treated in the hole. But one of the members of the audience wants to know a little bit more about solitary confinement and what that was like. Perhaps Emily could comment on legislation that's pending to abolish solitary confinement. So why don't we hear first from the panelists about what it was like to be in solitary, and then Emily can tell us about this pending legislation.
All right. Well, most of my time was spent in what is considered solitary confinement. However, there is there's kind of some levels to solitary confinement. There's some that's a more restrictive solitary confinement and some that's a little less restrictive solitary confinement. Nevertheless, either one is in a cell for 23 hours a day with 1 hour out of your cell. And even at the time out of your cell, you're isolated away from other inmates. And in some levels, even restrained by handcuffs and shackles. So for me, I feel like the solitary confinement really played a big part on my mental health. Even in some ways, at least how I identify, even, some good, maybe some good ways, just a little bit. Being in solitary confinement and being in a cell all day, it gave me time to like find myself or who I was. And it gave me time to study and read because we was able to get books. And it gave me time to even self-educate myself. However, though, it really messed up my social skills, because for a long time I was separated from like people, like other human beings. And even the few that I could talk to, I can't see them. We could talk through the doors or whatever. But you was gonna say something?
Yeah, I just want to give Emily a chance to tell us about this legislation that is possibly pending that would end solitary confinement.
Stop solitary confinement,
Yeah.
CT?
Yeah. Emily, do you know anything about this bill that one of the audience members has brought up?
Yes, there is a bill in Connecticut to end solitary confinement, and I think Jordan did an excellent job of describing what it's like and how difficult it is. I mean, in many ways, solitary confinement is a form of torture. People are social animals. We all need to be around other people, and keeping people who are being detained or imprisoned by themselves all the time can be incredibly damaging psychologically, and I think especially difficult with people with pre-existing mental conditions. So in Connecticut, there is a bill to end solitary, and I think it's one of the most important criminal justice reforms we could make as a state. It would put us in a kind of leadership role around the country. And one of the things that's important to highlight is this issue of levels of restriction that Jordan was talking about. We want to make sure that we're really ending solitary and not having it slide into like a lockdown by yourself for 23 hours a day, but it's really up to the guards whether you actually get that hour or not. There can be a lot of ways in which a kind of end run around ending solitary confinement that can effectively keep very, very difficult, onerous, kind of torturous conditions in place. So I think this is a good bill. I also think it's going to be important to watch and make sure that it's implemented in a way that really provides relief for people who are being held in very often difficult, damaging, and often unnecessary conditions.
Emily, related to this, we have a question about excessive force that is sometimes used by correctional officers. And I think it's also related to Betty's story about sexual mistreatment while she was in jail. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations on what we can do to address these problems?
So I think that there's a real vulnerability, this is the most, one of the most alarming aspects of extreme state power is that when the police or other agents of the state use unnecessary force, it can be really hard to prove that's what happened, and for people to get any kind of redress. And I think that's especially true, unfortunately, for people with mental illness, because they may be questioned and their accounts may not be taken as credible, even when they absolutely are credible. I think that the documenting on video that we are seeing happening more and more can be really important for this. Police body cameras are not proving to be a kind of panacea for the excessive use of force, but I still think we are better off with them than without them, and they are probably having some helpful effect in some places, especially when they're combined with greater legal restrictions. So this is kind of wonky, but one of the real problems we have with excessive use of force, especially by the police in this country, is that they're allowed to do it. And on the rare occasion where they're actually criminally prosecuted, juries have to believe that they had no reasonable threat of harm to themselves or to other people in this moment where they used force. And historically, juries have been very, very reluctant to hold police to that standard. I think the conviction of Derek Chauvin for second and third degree murder, as well as manslaughter, is really important, but also a rare event in American law. And so that legal standard, raising the bar, which is something that states and even cities can do, is a really important corrective. I mean, we could make it so that the police could only use force as a matter of last resort. And that would really change the way in which they can be liable for using force. And some people in the audience may also know about this problem of immunity, of qualified immunity that police have from lawsuits that are against them personally, or that counties and municipalities have for lawsuits against the cops. And I think that's another legal barrier here to preventing excessive use of force in situations where it really is not the only option that the police have.
Many people in the audience are interested in hearing about reentry services. What kinds of supports and programs people need when they get out of jail to get their life back on track. Emily, before I let the panel talk about their experiences, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think this is just a super important part of the picture. And one of the worst developments, I think, in this aspect of overpunishment is the way in which probation and parole services have really, in a lot of places, dropped any kind of social work function. So when court supervision began in the 1970s, it was seen as being rehabilitative, and that was supposed to be a really important thing that parole officers did. They helped connect you to job services, they helped you get treatment. They were supposed to be checking in on you in a way that was like good for you and designed to help you be a more productive citizen, as opposed to just like policing you and getting you in trouble. And I think there's some parole officers and probation officers that still function in that way. But I think a lot of times they're kind of going above and beyond the actual outline of their jobs. And this depends on jurisdiction. And so I'm not talking about any particular place in Connecticut, but I think this question of reentry is so vital. We have a huge problem with recidivism in this country across the board, where people who go to jail and prison and get out often end up cycling back in because jail and prison do not help them become more productive. They often fall into the kinds of patterns and the problems that we've been talking about. And so helping to make sure that people get out and they have a fair shot at staying out and at making their lives better is enormously important. And as a reporter, I'm just often struck by how much people are on their own. And they're on their own even though they have a conviction on their record, which makes it harder to get housing, to get a job, to get people to trust you. So I think this is a hugely important step, and we can't decarcerate and then fix reentry, because it's only if we have reentry right that decarceration is really going to succeed.
How about our panelists? Wes, what was your experience like when you got out? Did you find that the services were available that you needed to help you get a job? And
so my extent of experience, I had a 14-year sentence, and my extent at the end of my sentence was they called me down, made sure I had a Connecticut driver's license or a Connecticut ID, made sure I had a social security card, gave me the paperwork for Saga medical and food stamps, And that was the extent of the reentry. There is no help for people that are incarcerated, that are going home. There's no reentry program. There's nothing. And I just thank God that I had, some people in my life that was willing to give me a chance, give me housing, put me up until I was able to get a job and to pay some rent, I'm grateful for Fellowship Place where I was able to come, and get going and network and, my advisor worked with me, because I can be a tough cookie, but I'm grateful for the patience, so it's all about, there's nothing available for us in there. There really isn't, and it's sad. It really is. It's sad, so that's my experience.
I'm sorry to hear that. I'm just going to tell one quick story because I have to go, which is that I was just doing some reporting with someone who went to prison when he was 15. He went as a teenager, but he was charged as an adult. This was in Pennsylvania. He got out at 21 and he paroled to Atlanta, Georgia, because that's where his mom lived. And he was given the name of his parole officer in Georgia and nobody called him. So he called the parole officer and the parole officer said, "Don't call me, I'll call you. And if I need to talk to you," and actually hung up on him. Which he was like, "Is this a joke? Like, I thought I was supposed to check in." And the only contact he's had with the parole office is that every month he received instructions to dial into an automated service to answer some form questions. Are you still at the same residence? Where are you working? Have you changed your job? That's it. Which I think just goes to show that even the services you were talking about, which are inadequate and deficient, are not even available to everyone. I just want to say thank you so much for having me, and I really respect and admire the folks on this panel who are sharing their stories. It's really important for you to be giving these first-person accounts. You're the only people who can really describe what your experiences have been, and I've learned a lot from listening to you. And thank you very much to all of you at the Fellowship Place and all of your supporters.
Thank you, Emily. Before you go off, and we are respectful of your time, one question from the audience that you may know the answer to. The bill that you were talking about with regards to eliminating solitary confinement, do you have a bill number or a bill name so that people who are interested could reach out to their state senators and state representatives and express support for that bill?
I do not have the number at my fingertips, but I am looking for it. Oh, wait, I think I found it. It's Senate Bill number 1059, I think. And yeah, Senate Bill 1059, it's called the PROTECT Act. And the Judiciary Committee in the Connecticut State Senate reported out the bill, and it's supposed to be going to the House, I believe, according to this news story.
Great, thank you very much. So again, Emily, thank you so much for the time that you've spent with us and for sharing all of your knowledge with us. We're very, very grateful.
You are very welcome. Thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone who is supporting your organization and speaking at this event. I appreciate it.
Emily needs to leave, but our panel can stay a little bit longer, so I'm going to give them an opportunity to continue sharing some of their stories and answering questions from the audience. I just want to pick up where Wes left off about what it was like when you were released and what you needed to do to get the help that you needed to get your life on track. Jordan, do you want to share a little bit?
Yeah. I wanted to add on to, what Wes was saying about reentry and about the Department of Corrections just spitting guys back out to the streets without being corrected. And so in my experience, I have discovered a lot of reentry, services out here in the community. However, these are services that I did not know about while I was incarcerated. And, one thing that I want, people to understand about, there's just in my analyst and opinion, most people go through like 3 phases of their incarceration. So when you're first incarcerated, and you're starting out your sentence, however much time it is, it's like a very, stressful phase from leaving the community and fighting your case to being in prison and adapting to the prison environment. Then you go into a more of a acceptance phase. Somewhere, at some point down that line, you accept your situation for what it is, and you're saying, all right, well, I'm here for this amount of time, and I know at this time, the ones that's fortunate enough to get out, that this is when I get out. Now, I say that to say, during that time, and as you're getting closer to your release, it's kind of natural that people make their plans for, what they want to do when they get out, where they're going to go. So these are things that's in your mind while still incarcerated. Now, if I'm incarcerated and I'm trying to plan for my release and what I want to do when I get out and trying to gather whatever resources I have, if I don't know about the reentry resources that are in the community, those won't be accounted into that plan. So once that time comes that I'm released, and even once I do find out that there are, some resources, in a way it's kind of a little late because I've already programmed my mind on what route I want to take when I get out.
So is what you're saying, Jordan, that what would be helpful that was not happening at the time that you were in jail was if there was information given to you maybe 6 months or even a year before your release about planning for what it was going to be like when you got out and where you could go for help?
Yes, I think that the reentry resources that are here in the community for people that are being released, these organizations and resources need to be a part of that plan process, which starts while still incarcerated. So if I had somebody that was working with me a year, even 6 months before I'm incarcerated, I have somebody that's helping me put that plan together, and it'll be the same person that I'm working with in the community once I am released. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing that I've never seen within my time in incarceration that just, in my opinion, could be very helpful. Because it's either, depending on where you at or where you live or where you're being released to, there's either no resources or the resources that are available, we don't know about. And by the time we might know about them, some people might already have their mind made up on which route they want to go, which could be the wrong route, which leads to the recidivism.
So we just got a question from the audience that I think would be enlightening for everyone. And perhaps we could start with you, Betty. What was the single most difficult thing that you had to do to adapt when you got out of jail?
Wow, a single job, because
The hardest thing, what was the hardest thing when you got out that you had to adapt to life on the outside?
for me, it was ironic because I wasn't from this state and I find my way But anyway, it started from jail that they don't, I agree with Emily. I have to reiterate, they don't rehabilitate nobody. But sometimes they save people because, quote unquote, because I'm supposed to be labeled as a dominant person because of the shade of my skin. So they know where I'm at and they know where I'm going. In jail, they didn't give me this information to bring on the outside. So I didn't have no place to live. I didn't know no about no where to go get no SSI. I didn't know nothing. Didn't know nothing. And then, except because I was dual diagnosed, really my family didn't want to be bothered with me. So how could I do this by myself? So I just took one moment at a moment. I went into a program and I did the program. I came out with information. I went for 6 months. Then 6 months from there, I got my apartment and I keep moving on with the information. That's power, and that's my resources. I got housing, and I got education. I went on and got my diploma, not a GED, but equivalency. I took that time since I was here in 13 years. I did the intern, become a support specialist. I advocate. I sued my building. I did advocate for myself. I got the accountability to do this because I got that information.
So I don't want to interrupt.
Yes.
So it sounds like the hardest thing was just getting to know the community and getting to know what was available, and then step by step taking advantage of what was available.
Exactly.
How about you, Jordan? What was the hardest thing for you?
The hardest thing for me after being released, which I'm still struggling to this day, is establishing and reestablishing relationship with my family, more specifically my children, and just being a parent. That's because of my significant situation while in prison. My contacts and ability to communicate and see my family and my children were very, very limited and restricted. So therefore now coming out with, being able to have all the time in the world to establish that relationship is very struggling, because I think even back to what I was just saying with the reentry, for people that's incarcerated that are parents and have kids, I think that's something else that's necessary, some type of program that could help, establish those relationships with your loved ones, especially children.
That's a good point.
And parents.
Mm-hmm. Let's move on and give Wes a chance. Wes, what was the most difficult thing for you to adapt to when you got out?
Life.
Just life in general.
Life. I was institutionalized. If you're locked up for 14 years, you are institutionalized for the most part. So life. And so what I had to do was I had to keep it simple. Keep it simple. Baby steps, keep it simple. And prioritizing everything.
That's sort of the same thing that Betty was saying.
Because the truth be told, it's easy to go rob, steal, and cut up. It's easy to do that. So I didn't want that no more. So I had to get some skills where I can get a meaningful job that can pay some bills, save some money, sacrifice. You understand what I'm saying? Be humble, but be grateful. And that's where I'm at. Thanks.
So everyone in the audience is very interested in hearing about how you came to Fellowship Place and what kinds of help you're getting at Fellowship Place. Does anybody want to share a little bit about the work that you're doing here at Fellowship Place with your advisor?
I would like to. Yes, like I said in the beginning of the fellowship is like actually my family, due to that situation. But anyway, that's the reason. Well, fellowship helped me, gave me that scribe, that a place that I can go, that I don't have to be setting my mess alone, that I have an advisor to talk to. I can get counselor. I can even pull any advisor that if something going on with me that which my clinician may be not available. And I have that here to fellowship, someone to talk to. They can give you a direction, a sense of direction, a sense of, it's like somebody there, after all the madness, that somebody do care, and that this place a fellowship for me. Now, at the moment, I'm seeking more education. I want to finish my associate. So I'm going for my certificate and then go on, and then go on and get my degree.
And we're helping you with going
And
back to
fellowship is
school.
helping me, educational is helping me with that. They help me just to know that fellowship they have this place here for doing that, know these people. Instead of being out there on the green looking crazy or being crazy, that's not my style. But who knows? I maybe would have been there if it wasn't for fellowship since 2007. 2007, I came a long way. I'm a superior supporter, especially I sit down and run groups too. Okay, I'm on the CEO board. I'm not bragging, but yet still, this is how far I came. Okay, I can be if I push on, but
It's
just
just because we're going to be running out of time.
I know, okay.
And I want to give everybody equal time.
Okay, terrific.
Jordan, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you're doing here at Fellowship Place?
Yes. I'm fairly new to Fellowship Place, but so far since I've been here, I just received so much help with my who I'm working with. I don't know if I'll say name.
You can say her name.
Yeah. So since I've been working with Julia, she just brought so many things out of me and so much confidence that I didn't have. And we're working with employment. So she's helping me seek employment, which is going very well. And I'm very grateful for it because before I came to fellowship, I was like on my own with it. And it was kind of hard. I did all right, but it's still, I didn't really have the blueprint of what I need to do to get to where I need to go. And fellowship provided that for me. And I'm very grateful for it. And also this opportunity to even speak on something that I'm very passionate about through my experiences, because this here is something that I didn't even expect to be a part of when I came to fellowship. Mm-hmm. So even that opportunity there, I'm very grateful for.
You're very articulate, good spokesperson.
Thank you.
And how about, last but not least, Wes down at the end, can you share a little bit with us about what you do here at Fellowship Place?
Certainly. So first and foremost, I got to say I have the best advisor at Fellowship Place, Joyce. She's awesome. I could be having a bad day at work and I get a phone call and she puts a smile on my face. She changes the whole tone of the day. I appreciate that. So it really means a lot to have somebody that's thinking about you, when you're not around. So for me, I'm thankful and grateful. Life is coming together for me. I work a lot of hours. I do meetings. Fellowship Place has gotten me so much, really. I could not have nothing in my house to eat and come to Fellowship Place and get a nice hot meal. I'm not too proud to speak on that, because I maintain my gratitude. I do. I'm thankful and grateful. I'm getting the skills to be able to, interact with people because I'm an isolator. you know, and for all my life, that's what I've done. So it's hard to just stop doing something that I'm used to doing, you know, and I'm able to talk to my advisor about things that, you know, it's good to be able to build a trust with somebody and be comfortable with speaking to them. You know, I was involved with the employment aspect of fellowship, but I received employment, you know, on my own, which is a good thing. But I am grateful and thankful for fellowship. I'm grateful for Charlotte. She's also very important in my life. She checks on me all the time, and whenever I need something done, resumes, whatever the situation is, you know, they're there for me. I'm just grateful for Fellowship Place. I really am, you know, and
So
that's it.
thanks. So just to wrap up, we had several questions related to something that Emily talked about, and that is the idea of a crisis response team, which brings together social workers and other mental health professionals, sometimes with the police, sometimes not with the police, to respond to 911 calls that are related to some kind of mental health crisis. And people in the audience wanted to know if we have anything like that here in Connecticut. And I'm really, really happy to report that here in New Haven, the Connecticut Mental Health Center is working with the New Haven Police on the development of a crisis response team. They're in the very early planning stages. And we heard at a meeting this morning that it will probably take at least 6 months before it is up and running. But what this means when it is operational is that if a parent calls 911 and says, I'm really concerned about my son or my daughter, he's having a mental health episode and he's very angry and he's yelling and he's screaming and I'm not sure what he's going to do next, that it won't just be the police responding to that call, but that someone trained in mental health, probably a clinical social worker, will go out and try to de-escalate the situation. So that's progress that we're making here in New Haven. And I know that some other cities in the state are also moving in that direction. And in fact, I believe in Waterbury, social workers are now actually on the staff at the police department and go out on a lot of these calls. What do you all think? Do you think, that's a move in the right direction? Do you think having mental health people go out with the police or perhaps in place of the police is something that we need more of?
Yes, I agree with that provision. It's good because, I don't seen cases like that before. I mean, they had a knife, but the police shot them 13 times. This guy just had a knife. You could have shot him one time, bring him down instead of killing. You see what I'm saying? So now that response, what you're talking about, it's good. You can talk to that person, that person can hear somebody have some empathy and some empathy for them at the same time. They need that empathy and sympathy. You can't just come to you make them more upset when you're doing things to them. So they need somebody to talk to them, to calm them, not point guns at them.
Yeah.
Good point. How about you?
Yeah, and I agree that mental health workers should be out there with the police to help de-escalate certain situations. Kind of like to bring it back to in prison. And in prison, they have a certain protocol with, those severe people that's labeled mental health, that before any type of use of force could be administered on that person, it would have to be cleared by mental health first. So if there's a situation going on with those that are just the ones that are labeled as severe mental health, the mental health worker has to try to verbally de-escalate that situation. And then once that's exhausted where they can't, then it could be, you know, to any whatever force needs to, you know, happen. That's how it works in prison. And I think something similar should be done for in the streets, especially if it's a person that's known having, like, you know, depending on the situation, you know, every situation is different, but, you know, I done seen, like she said, I done seen things on the news where you had a person having a domestic incident, and the person was labeled mental health, and there was nobody there to intervene but the officers, who all they knew to do and trained to do was to apply that force. So I think that would be helpful.
Thanks. So we're just about out of time, but I do, many of the questions that came through asked about funding for mental health programs and funding for halfway houses and group homes as an alternative to incarceration. And I do want to let everybody know that funding for a lot of mental health programs in the state, including Fellowship Place, has relatively been flat for many, many years. Back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when the large state psychiatric hospitals like Fairfield Hills and Connecticut Valley Hospital were downsizing or closing altogether, there was money invested in the communities to get programs like Fellowship Place started up. Unfortunately, as time went on and as the state's economy shifted and wasn't always doing as well as it could, a lot of the money that was coming from the state really didn't keep up with the true cost of providing the services that we provide. So that's put a lot of pressure on agencies like us to keep up with the demand for services and to expand services. You know, there's a lot more that we would like to do, but we can't do because the funding isn't always there. Related to that, if anyone is interested in supporting the agency and supporting the work that we're doing with people like those that you met tonight on our panel, there is an opportunity for you to make a donation, large or small. All of it will be invested back into our programs. And we've made it really, really easy for you. If you want to make a donation because you are inspired by what you heard tonight, you can text the word Fellowship Place to 844-581-2022. I believe that number is also going to be up on the screen for a few minutes after we close. And I also encourage you to go to our website on www.fellowshipplace.org. You can also donate through the website. And it's just about 8 o'clock, and we said that we would conclude by then. I do want to really thank and give a big round of applause to our panelists. I think that you were all very, very eloquent in sharing your stories and very brave as well. It's not easy to tell the stories that you told. So thank you very, very much. And of course, we want to thank Emily. I think that she was wonderful and very insightful. And I want to thank everybody in the audience who chose to be a part of the conversation tonight. I hope that you will take some of the information that you heard tonight and share it with your friends, your neighbors, your family. The best way to create change is to raise awareness and to come together and talk about these things and reach out to our legislators and to our leaders to advocate for more change. So as I believe Andrew told us at the very beginning of the evening, May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do this program tonight was to raise awareness about mental health and how it intersects with the criminal justice system. And I think you guys did a great job
Thank
at
you.
doing that. So thank you, everybody. It was really a pleasure to be a part of this tonight.